Welcome, everybody. One more webinar Wednesday. This is part of our series of webinars that we do every second Wednesday of the month, primarily targeted towards improving the supply chain conversation in the industry. We have very interesting speakers every edition talking about different aspects in supply chain. And today we have Paul Blom, and I would say he's the first international speaker that we have. I'm confused. Is Canada actually international?
It depends on whether you're talking about vacationing or work.
Okay. So thanks, Paul, for joining us. I'm going to let Paul introduce himself and start the sessions, but few interesting things that have popped up with my conversations and Paul. He has, though he doesn't look like it, he has more than 4 decades of experience. Is that a right number, or should I increase it by one more decade?
No, you're good. You're good with 4.
All right, okay. So yeah, he looks a lot younger, but he has more than 4 decades of experience in supply chain, working across different industries, electronics, and currently he's in toys with Spin Master. So he brings in a lot of industry experience from different kinds of supply chain. And one of the things he's done, his claim to fame, besides, of course, creating supply chain efficiencies, is that he loves golf, and he has played golf in golf courses in at least 6 different countries.
Yeah, I think six just in Asia.
6 just in Asia. Okay, 6 Asian countries. So that's, I think, is a claim that's an interesting statistic to have. So yeah, so he brings this. Probably that's where he learned a lot of his supply chain, I guess. So he brings all this industry experience, and when we were talking, we decided that there is an industry way to do supply chain. And so we decided that could be an exciting topic for our audience. And Paul, it's you take us through the next about 35 minutes of the presentation, and then we'll have 10-15 minutes of questions.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks for the opportunity to join in. And if you have some questions or things we can chat on at the end, that would be great. The topic I picked, in part because I've had the opportunity to work across a few different supply chains or industries over the years, is talking about the characteristics of industry and how you use those to inform your decision making, whether it's on supply chain process, partnerships, IT, analytics, and that sort of thing. So I thought I'd start just with a little bit of a comment on supply chain strategy. And as you develop strategy within your company for supply chain, you always start off with, where are we today? What's the current state? What's our business model? Has it changed? Is it going to change? What organization do we have today? Processes and technologies that are in play. And then understanding the unique characteristics and challenges of your business. And this is a bit where I get into the commentary later on ecosystems, because depending on where you sit within an industry or ecosystem, that'll have a lot to do with, what are the right choices for, driving improvement and an advantage. How will you evolve the supply chain to enable competitive advantage? And it's not so much supply chain competitive advantage, really the competitive advantage of your company as you're out trying to win in the marketplace. And then what are the strategy milestones along the way? And what are the measures of success and the KPIs? It's often that investments get made with kind of a fuzzy notion as to what the improvements will be. Having a real measured approach to, here's what we'll spend, here's what we expect as gains, and here's how we're going to measure them, is part of what I call a strong strategy process. How will the business processes change or evolve, and the technology stack that supports those processes need to evolve? And it's a bit of a challenge. Investing is the easier part. Divesting of parts of the technology stack is difficult and usually less glamorous, but it's a pretty important step as well. What are the cross-functional collaboration mechanisms that you'll have between sales, supply chain, finance, IT, so that work that goes on, because while you're developing a supply chain strategy, the IT team is sitting in a room developing an IT strategy, and those really need to come together through collaboration. And then what's the future going to look like? What's the future state you're targeting? What's the strategy roadmap? Not just dependencies on other functions, but third parties and external partners, whether it's 3PLs, freight, logistics, analytics companies. How will you express those dependencies and address them in the strategy? And then as you go through all this, what's your formal approach to change management so that things change as they're planned to, and things stick? One line that I just want to key off of from that page is that whole thing of understanding the unique characteristics and challenges to your business. And that really leads me into what I call the viewing of industries as ecosystems, and being able to further segment them and understand where do you play within that ecosystem. Now, included in the appendix page, you can have a huge number of other businesses and supply chain ecosystems beyond the 4 that I've shown here. I just picked these 4 because a lot of time I've spent over the years has given me experience in these areas. Understanding your place within the ecosystem helps you to understand approaches to optimization. And as I look at the different ecosystems, kind of the difference between talking about an industry perspective and an ecosystem perspective, if I just picked the toy industry that I'm in today, and if I wanted to understand where can I get skill sets, where might I want to look at best of breed solutions or supply chain systems and processes, one of the areas I would look is in clothing, women's clothing, fashion. It has 2 store sets per year. Toys have 2 store sets per year. A lot of Asian sourcing, a lot of goods move on ocean containers instead of in the air. So many commonalities between those 2. If I looked at Procter & Gamble, very different from someone like a Mattel, where it's really much more flow of goods, a continuous flow. Procter & Gamble owns a lot of their own factories. They're dialing up and dialing down production, and they're normally local within the geography they're serving. So probably less of an advantage to look for people and skills there if you're in the toy industry than looking at Levi's, Nike, or an apparel company. As I look at technology, aerospace, retail, merchandise, and government, I've just shown some of the logos there a bit for orientation on what do I mean by those. And the companies that play in these spaces are so different. I'm going to take the technology stack here and just dive into it a little bit more and break it into some of the, call it, sub-segments. Within technology, a lot of times we'll be thinking of something from Dell or Cisco or Juniper Networks, and those are the product names, really pretty sexy. They deliver incredible stuff to the marketplace. But in behind them are some major companies doing product manufacturing. Cisco, Dell, Juniper, for the most part, they do no manufacturing. Hewlett Packard, IBM, these companies have outsourced pretty well all of it to the companies that you see under product manufacturing. That's a very long list. These are just the larger tier players. You typically hear about Foxconn. If you're in the industry, you'll know some of the other names. Celestica, Tom and I worked for a good number of years. It was a spin-off of the IBM operations in Canada. And so these companies, as they look at investing in IT capabilities, the requirements are much different from a Cisco, a Juniper, or a Dell. Cisco, Juniper, Dell, if you look at the whole planning and demand management side of their business, they're trying to understand forecasts from their sales and marketing teams. They're trying to understand configurations of systems and how to outsource then the manufacturing. The product manufacturing teams are investing in demand simulation systems and other things that allow connectivity back into the electronic components world. that the brand companies aren't spending money on. So the technology stack evolves very differently. And then if you're in the electronic components business, these businesses have lead times to expand capacity and add manufacturing plants that are measured in years. So the capacity reservation systems, the long-term planning processes become a lot more important to companies like NVIDIA, Intel, Broadcom, in order to do what they need to do to then service the end market. And then I put on the bottom product design and IP creation. That used to sit with the IBMs and the Ciscos and the Dells, and it's become much more gray area over the years. So the design systems are showing up across the spectrum. Who owns the intellectual property? You hear a lot about NVIDIA and autonomous vehicles. You hear about Broadcom and high-end communications. These companies own more and more intellectual property downstream now. And so who owns the design is much more of a gray area. And that then plays into different types of investments for the design systems. For people that are in the IT world, or sorry, the IT selling world, selling the IT platforms, they've had to stay on top of this over the years. They've had to evolve their product and their service offerings as the spaces have changed a little bit in terms of who does what. And then finally on the right, you've got cloud data centers, you've got transportation systems, you've got end consumers, if you're talking about cell phones, that are consuming all of this technology and making use of it. If I go back again to the four ecosystems of technology, aerospace, retail, and government, if you look at the focus areas for optimizing, they're very different under each of the four. Now, when I talk about technology and aerospace in a few minutes, there's a lot of similarities there, so I'm going to leverage that a bit in the discussion. But if I go down the technology side, speed to market with new product and capability is huge. Lead times and managing long lead times for semiconductors and the overall product, and the movement of product. The number of frequent flyer miles inside a high-end router from someone like Cisco or Juniper Networks is incredible. Silicon travels around the world. It gets made as a wafer and a die in one country. It gets turned into a finished molded component in another country. It gets put on a circuit board in another country. There's incredible lead time tied to that. And there's a lot of bill of material complexity. If you take a high-end router or switch and look at the bill of material, it's quite an enormous file and needs a lot of attention and management. So those are big things if you're in the technology world. If I then go into the aerospace world, there are similarities to technology, but now you're getting into the world of safety, reliability, and risk. You've got people sitting on airplanes. Contract compliance. If you look at how Boeing sells aircraft into the airlines, or how someone like Honeywell sells components into the airlines, there are huge contracts that sit in behind this. And so you have teams of people working contract compliance, and that has a lot of implications on the supply chain, tracking data, and the systems that are used for that. Bill of material complexity, if you can imagine, a MAX, 737 MAX, or a 787 aircraft from Boeing, you can just imagine the size of the bill of material for that aircraft. And then it gets broken into what are called line replaceable units, which there are suppliers that feed into Boeing and Airbus and others, and they deliver modules of capability. So there might be a cabin pressure system module or cockpit modules that get produced. So they break their bill of material quite often into these replaceable units that go into the aircraft. Supply allocation is huge, not just into the aircraft manufacturing, but if you picture when you fly on a plane and that plane has to be serviced real time at an airport, those service parts need to be pre-allocated and delivered into the maintenance teams at the airports all around the world. And then the last one, if you're in the aerospace business, an AOG, it stands for aircraft on ground. which is exactly what you don't want. You do not want aircraft sitting on the ground and stranded. So there's a whole business process in the aerospace business to respond to aircraft being stranded on the ground. It's a little bit like an emergency service part. So similar to technology, but some other critical performance areas. If I jump into retail merchandising, you're now in a very different world. And I've been in two companies where we fed into, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, and others. And it is a very different world. The distribution requirements, regional distribution centers you feed into, working with the third-party logistics providers is a huge, huge challenge. And it's a big opportunity for optimization and for savings within the business of feeding into retail or executing retail. So much time is spent on getting your shelf space and point of sale performance and managing in stock. I mentioned ocean and ground freight here. If you're in the toy industry, if you're in Hasbro, if you're in Mattel, or if you're in Spin Master, as soon as you start putting toys in the air, you've lost money. Your toys need to move ocean and ground in order to hit gross margin requirements. And then e-commerce selling. If you look at, again, I'll reference the toy industry here. The major toy companies, and the big four are Lego, Hasbro, Mattel, and Spin Master. Individually, these companies don't do a lot of direct e-commerce selling. They do some, it's single-digit percentage stuff. It's not big. But if you ask the question, end consumers, when they buy a toy, what percent of the time are they going through some kind of an e-commerce experience? That was in the mid 20% prior to COVID. Coming out of COVID, it was hitting the mid 30%. And that was sales through Amazon. It was sales through Walmart.com and other .coms around the world. If you were in the UK, you would have what's called click and collect. So you basically do your purchase online and drive to the store. And then during COVID, we even had, online buying, and you would sit in the parking lot and wait for your toy to be brought to you. So it was extremely important for all the toy companies to understand how to do the marketing, how to do the tracking, how to understand performance of the online experience. And within the whole supply chain team, knowing where the marketing dollars were being spent to push your products higher up in what's called the buy box, so that you're hitting stride in terms of sales. And then the last one is managing fines and penalties. The big retailers have a line item in their P&L called billing their suppliers fines and penalties for late delivery, not being in full, not being on time, OTIF, which is on time in full, kind of multiplied together. And this is in the millions and millions of dollars. So as a supplier to the retailers, it becomes a pretty important thing to have good systems wrapped around and good data. I mentioned government as well, because if you look at government, hospitals, these are areas where it's all indirect procurement. And a lot of focus on process compliance, a lot of focus on, fraud prevention. Getting value for spend has been a much bigger topic in government organizations over the last decade. And that's driving some of the IT investments and systems. And I'll mention later folks like iValue and Coupa, a lot of homegrown software and capability, a lot of in-ERP capability, and then a lot of these bolt-ons that are indirect procurement platforms. I'll stay away from the military branch because governments typically have that as a sectioned off portion of the procurement engine. If I look at all four areas and the logos that I showed earlier, one of the things they have in common is at the center of the IT stack is the ERP platform. And three of the big names, I mean, I hope I'm not offending, providers of Infor and JDA and all the others, but the big three that I've seen over the years have really been SAP, Oracle, and then a bit more lately on Microsoft Dynamics. And this is really sitting at the core, and there's always that tough decision. What things do you do inside your ERP? What things do you do outside? Some companies really focus on best of breed applications that interconnect to their ERP. Some companies try to push as much into the ERP platform as possible. Both have their challenges. I only recommend do your homework before you pick one strategy or another. Whether you're talking about HR systems, supply chain systems, even managing of 3PL capabilities. I'm going to talk about the first two for a minute here on technology and aerospace. And if you ask the question, where are the investments being made in supply chain, in IT, in data, in analytics? And I include, by the way, when I say analytics, I include AI as a portion of analytics. The hardware design systems is a big investment area, everything to do with product data management or what are called PDM systems. If you're in that space where you're manufacturing the goods, you get a lot more into the scenario planning and simulation systems, which rely on high speed, offline capabilities. A lot of use of electronic component distributors, companies like Aero, Avnet, World Peace Group in Asia, TTM in the US. The forecast sharing and purchasing portals, a lot of interconnect in the total supply chain on technology and aerospace happens through portals and through data exchange. If you picture someone like a Boeing working with all the aerospace component companies that feed into them, they can't custom design their software to connect to any one company. They have to have generic portal capabilities and make it a requirement for their suppliers to figure out how to connect in. As you go the next tier down, you have the same sort of thing happening. Import-export controls always has been a big area. It's becoming more challenging lately. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then everything to do with field service and customer management on the IT support side. I just list a few here. It would take pages and pages to cover all the different systems just for these challenges that sit on the left side. If I go to retail, very different set of challenges. You're now going from dealing with complicated bills of materials and part numbers into the world of SKUs and barcodes. You're fighting to have in stock, and through in stocks drive point of sale or POS market share. And you've got this growing challenge across the e-com spectrum. So understanding, how much of your total demand plan is going to flow through shelf retail versus e-com becomes important as well. The demand management platforms are important, and understanding how to then launch from that demand into your buys or into your commitments. So if you're into toy, if you're into clothing, women's apparel as an example, you're making those buys 4, 6, sometimes 8 months in advance. You have to have design freeze, sometimes 10 to 12 months in advance of goods actually landing in country. Supply allocation has a completely different meaning in retail than it does in technology and aerospace. When you talk about supply allocation in technology, you're talking about how to take components and allocate those to the next level of assembly. When you talk about supply allocation in the toy industry, for example, you've given months in advance a demand plan to your toy manufacturers, and a high percentage of toy manufacturing, by the way, is sourced to third parties. Supply allocation is as the finished goods are coming off the production line, it's allocating to the distribution centers around the world how much ships into each geography. So supply management is a completely different definition. So if someone's moving from working in a technology company as a leader to a company feeding into retail, just the jargon is going to have a lot of difference to it, and the systems that sit in behind managing it. Packaging, replenishment systems, portals, those are all things you're going to be focused on and spending on. Managing what's called the direct import process. That's where you may have a company that ships 20,000 containers per year worth of goods from Asia to North America and Europe. Half of that might flow through your own management, and half of it would go through the management system of Walmart, Target, Amazon, and other large retailers, where they take title of the goods in Asia and they own them on the ocean and manage it themselves and leverage the strength that they have in terms of procurement of freight. So just understanding how to manage the split between direct import by the retailers and then your own domestic strategies in your both ERP systems and in your planning systems. Ocean container booking and tracking. This has always been a bit of a challenge to me. It's kind of 2/3 manual and 1/3 using automation and data. Warehouse management systems, where you have 3PL warehouses around the world, each one's going to have a WMS in it. Bit of a challenge if you have multiple 3PL players supporting you around the world. If you're maybe with a DSV, a Schenker, and an XPO in different geographies, they may have different WMS systems deployed. So you're going to have the challenge of interfacing and connecting in, whether it's through EDI or other transactions, into a different stack of systems depending on who your partner is. And then point of sale and in-stock data. I'll talk in a minute about Circana as a platform. And this is where now you're into data as a service, which is kind of nice because you don't have to own the IT. You don't have to worry about upgrading it. You're really just buying the data as a service. If I explode this out into some of the different areas, I mentioned Circana off to the left. It used to be called NPD. And I think NPD might have even had parts of what was once Nielsen Ratings, but it's really the data company that feeds into the stock market analysts, the companies. They make their money bringing together data and analytics on the whole retail experience. They're very big in the toy industry and many other industries in terms of helping you understand market share, point of sale, and they get direct data feeds from all the big retailers. On the warehouse management side, you've got platforms like Manhattan. So the ERPs typically have something that they offer. So you have to decide, if you have your own warehouse, am I going to install the ERP platform, or am I going to buy a Red Prairie, a Manhattan, or something like that? And then on the whole track and trace and visibility side, there's a lot of system activity, whether it's with Maersk, DSV, UPS's systems, FedEx's systems. Your challenge as a company is really deciding, how am I going to take that data and how granular do I want to make it? I will tell you that in my company, while we went through COVID and we had all these vessels sitting off the coast of California, we spent a lot of time and money getting now detail on what SKUs and quantities sat in each ocean container so that we could prioritize them when they finally got unloaded. And then on the government side, I'll just open this one up. It's really about indirect procurement. Governments typically don't make things, so they're spending enormous amounts on managing contracts and the whole RFP and RFQ process. And again, it's really about having all the controls that you need on the indirect procurement process. Now, I added a little bit. Piyush and Tom and I talked a little bit about this whole thing, global, regional, local supply chains, and I've got a couple of pieces from Saturday's Wall Street Journal here, and it's really a conversation about managing risk and how long does it take you to evolve to a different sourcing strategy in different geographies. Some of what we're hearing about is reducing dependency on China. Labor costs are up, a lot of trade risk, friction back and forth between the US and China. Number of factors having companies revisit. And then again, I think it was yesterday or the day before, some articles again in the Wall Street Journal about how much is actually coming out of China and going into other geographies. Now, there are many companies moving things out of China, but they're moving them right next doors into Vietnam or into Indonesia or into Thailand for production. They're not necessarily bringing them back into Mexico or US for production. The ocean freight delays that we saw during COVID was a huge wake-up call. And if CFOs and CEOs weren't spending much time on supply chain, once this stuff hit, it was in every board meeting, every executive meeting. I mean, it's over the last several years, one thing COVID did is if you were a student in university studying supply chain, or you were a supply chain professional, all of a sudden everyone on your street understood what that term meant. And if I go back to the 90s, and if you said you worked in supply chain, people kind of looked at you in a confused way. Those delays resulted in container costs going from $2,000 to $3,000 a container up to $10,000 to $15,000 a container. So that got you into the CFO's office really quickly. A lot of benefits in Mexico, Eastern Europe, and the other parts of Asia. Vietnam's getting a bit saturated. They only have 90 million people, so they can only absorb so much from China. So you're starting to see more companies spend time in Indonesia as kind of that next geography. And you've got all the tariff and import costs and things that you're dealing with as well that are encouraging, in some case, the shift to regional supply chains. I referenced the 301 or the Trump tariffs, as a lot of people call them, and other protectionisms that sit within the EU that are causing companies to think about doing more in Europe sourcing. And then you've got the government programs that are impacting the supply chain. So when someone says we're going to implement Buy America, all of a sudden the commodity leaders, the sourcing teams and companies get engaged to say, okay, what does this mean to us and how do we have to change? Each ecosystem is going to have unique requirements. And the important thing is the timelines and the costs to pick up and move. In the toy industry, you can move inside 6 to 12 months. In the aerospace industry, it could take you 2 to 3 years with all the qualifications that need to happen. So having a strategy to move the supply chain, you need to be thinking about the connectivity, the IT platforms, the flows of data, but you need to also be thinking about how long does it actually take to move and qualify and certify new sources. Sometimes looking backwards gives you a little bit on how to move forwards, and I'm going to talk about that as I frame up some companies going from global strategies back to regional strategies. 1960s, highly vertical, 1970s and 80s, and this was Tom and I starting in IBM. If you were buying a server or a mainframe in Europe, it was manufactured in Europe. If you were buying one in Asia, it was made in Japan or other countries in Asia. And if you were buying in North America, chances are the high end was either coming out of New York State or Minnesota or other parts of the United States. So highly regional. As you saw the shift in the 90s, 2010, first you saw it in terms of sub-assemblies, power supplies, electronic board assemblies, and then eventually the entire products to the point where laptops and desktops and things like that just got farmed into what are called ODM companies in Asia. So these were kind of waves that we went through. And then the stuff in blue starts to happen. And this puts pressure on a lot of the sourcing and supply chain strategies that were in play and all the connectivity and systems that are linking the different players together. And if I call it, the post-COVID era, companies will continue to sell and produce globally. General Motors is still looking to sell cars around the world. The different companies, be it Procter & Gamble or Unilever, is still looking to sell around the world. But they're going to keep revisiting whether they're in-feed supply chains should be local to that region or global. And I think you're going to see that keep getting tested over time. You're going to see folks continue to try to figure out how to balance that out. Kind of a last page that I've got here. As you're thinking about your sourcing strategy, the supporting supply chain, and by definition, then the connectivity with partners and the systems that you're deploying, remember that the supply chain will keep trying to find a new equilibrium. Every time we throw something at it, the Trump tariffs, the Buy America, restrictions in Europe, things going on an electronics ban with China, companies will innovate and work to get to a new equilibrium where they're able to live within those new constraints. As part of that, stay close to what's going on in the government agendas. That wasn't as big a deal in the 90s as it is today. Have a clear strategy on sourcing, and inside that strategy, if you're a global sourcer and you have a high dependency on Asia, have a specific Asia strategy and call outs for that. South America and Africa, depending on the business you're in, you should see them coming online more. Particularly as you see, countries like Vietnam and Indonesia and others start to get saturated, that's going to push up their labor rates, and it's going to create opportunity for other continents. It'll probably be slow. Understand with all of that, how do I leverage process, technology, and data? And then remember that some of the past experiences on managing regional supply chains versus global can inform the future approaches. It's really the same challenge with a different backdrop. The people, the skills, the collaboration that are needed. I'm sure that all of you understand deeply. This is about systems and processes, but more than that, it's about the people that drive them and bring them together. And then change management and adoption. A lot of things get deployed and not adopted. And there's shadow IT and background work that goes on. So it's really, as leaders, a big deal to make sure that we get adoption when we go out and put things in play. I'm going to stop there. I think I've gone a little bit over, but Tom, Piyush, should we see if there's any questions?
Yes, we are open. Thank you for that wonderful session. So I'll open it. Anybody has questions?
Paul, I got one. This is Tom. So just going back to one of your earlier slides, you talked about the importance of early supplier involvement, particularly in the tech space. And trying to, understand now that the IP is sort of, spread across multiple companies, and, you have to plan that well in advance and build your business around it. With some of the reshoring that's happening, we've got the CHIPS Act in the US and so forth. So some of those industries are coming back to the US. Does reshoring help with that because it involves businesses that are closer, or does it have any impact at all on that?
I'd probably hit two things. One is it can help because you have people in geography, same time zone, same language, working together. I would say that the technology industry is highly evolved in terms of how partners work together. So I think and if I use as an example, Broadcom produces the chipsets that go into the communication systems that run the data centers. Mm-hmm. And all of the partners who make communications boxes for those data centers work with Broadcom very early on the configuration of the next chipset coming out. And so they're able to do that regardless of where they sit in the world. But I do think on reshoring, the ability to create a finished product without as many, call it, impacts from legislation, I think is a lot better.
Okay, thank you.
I think it'll be interesting in the automotive world when you have companies like NVIDIA and others. Governments have their hands very deep in what goes on in automotive and deployed vehicles on the road. So when you talk about autonomous vehicles and companies like NVIDIA, there's a lot of hurdles to go and take that global.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have one, Piyush.
Yeah,
Hi,
go ahead, Pete.
hi, Paul. Pete Rusano
Hi.
with Ever Access USA. Thanks for your sharing your insights and ecosystem perspective. That was a good way to frame your talk. Paul, I've previously worked for consumer products companies. Uh, they've served retail channels, big box, chain drug, food, convenience stores. I'm less familiar with the toy sector. And so I'm curious from a macro perspective, what are some of the KPIs for your function and your business that you all have established that you have defined that are critical to success for your business at a big picture level? I know it's probably an hour long.
If I take it from the selling side, I mean, the sales
Yes.
team, your sales team is going to want in stock and POS. And the other side of that is to give them everything they want, you would have to over rotate on the inventory you're buying. And so you have this tension between the buys that you're committing, especially if you have seasonal product or product in our business that has to be timed to the next movie release. If you overbuy, then you're going to spend a lot of money discounting and selling off in alternate channels the excess inventory. And
At a discount, I'm sure.
And the first thing I find is at that point in time, the sales folks, they get the heck out of the room because they don't want to get caught in that. And so one of the things you end up having to do at the executive level is make sure that your peer on the sales side of the organization also owns the dispositioning of that excess inventory, and that the P&Ls that are used. So some salespeople are paid on revenue. Some have profit margin in there. The ones that have profit margin in there, they're usually higher up in the organization. They need to have the loss or write down on goods affect that P&L as well as all the good revenue that happened. And when you accomplish that, now you have the inventory, the planning, the inventory buying side, and the inventory management side connected to this whole push for in-stock and point of sale.
In stock
And then, as you say, is there a spot where teams can collaborate? E-commerce is an opportunity at times for regular selling, but it's also an opportunity for bundling excess inventory and trying to get a reasonable, get it moved quickly and get a reasonable amount of money for it. So there's spots for collaboration and there's spots where you have to have some of that natural tension.
Makes sense. Just one quick follow-up. I'll let the others get to others as too. How about some of the demand management aspects insofar as having that be a measurable for the selling organization? I mean, is that also critical? I mean, if you get the mix right, you're going to certainly help the ops side of the house have that right in stock and POS. But if they're way off on the mix, it's not always supply side's fault. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the interesting challenge that I had was when I joined Spin Master, things had gotten a little bit sideways. It's very public, so I'm not telling you anything out of school here. One of the things that we needed to really quickly get our arms around was the S&OP process. And the S was not big enough in the S&OP process. And when that happens, you usually end up with too much inventory. You fill up warehouses. You have all kinds of stuff sitting on the ocean that you might not need. And so it's really that, if you use kind of the traditional 5-step S&OP process, at a minimum run it once a month with mid-month adjustments. I think for seasonal retail, I don't know if it's the best practice, but I know it's one that works. If you start to go too frequently, then you're just kind of jerking around the vendors and sending them noise. But it's the ownership that sales and the sales planning side has. And one of the things I discovered was the tools were inadequate for a global organization. So we had to go and hit some of the tool side of it, not just the people and the meetings and that sort of thing. So that we brought good data into the pre-consensus and the demand consensus. It was pretty lively, but our company got into a bit of trouble. So when that happens, it's amazing how people can rally around a project to make the improvement happen.
That's good. I like that. Thank you, Paul. I like SNOP with a big S.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's a lot of humility that has to come into that process. You know, there's sometimes the egos at stake and past things that have gone on, and a bit of simplicity and humility goes a long way in that process.
Well said. Right, more questions. We are at the ending time, but yeah, we don't want to end the questions so early.
I got to pick on Rob here. Rob, what's on your mind? What are you thinking about these days?
Listen, I appreciate that last question that Pete asked. You know, Paul, what goes in my mind around that conversation is the connectedness, not only across the global supply chain, but the connectedness between what we do in assembly and distribution to what's occurring with the data and the inventory. And it's my experience that there's a siloed effect that occurs between how we lay out lines, how we address lead times, how we position raw materials with FGI, and then connect the data to be able to understand what's occurring. There's some really good players in the industry that have got their heads around that. But there's folks that, you know, are struggling with kind of that legacy MRP, disconnected from, you know, what's happening in the physical architecture of facilities or that end-to-end supply chain.
Yeah, thanks for that. One of the things, you know, as you mentioned, distribution centers. When I joined Spin Master, walking the warehouses, do not underestimate how important it is to walk the warehouses. How many half pallet slots, quarter pallet, you know, loads you have sitting in there. How much someone ordered goods, not realizing, you know, we had this one, the Gund brand. You see the Gund teddy bear here behind me. These are all our toys, by the way. There was this Pusheen, that's the name of a characters that, and they were huge. And someone ordered extra inventory, not realizing that only 3 units fit on a pallet or 4 units fit on a pallet. And when you order 500 or 1,000 of something, and there's only 4 that fit on a pallet, you can fill a football field size warehouse really quickly. Yeah. And so these were some of the sins of the past that had to be cleaned up when I arrived. And it was, you know, folks were using their systems, not looking at, you know, cube volume implications, and you know, things got a little bit out of control. And that needed to have been a result of each month's SNOP to say, okay, what's the cube, or what our Asia team, they called it CBMs, cubic meters of goods that equate to the MRP output. And are there any spikes? Are there any SKUs that are anomalies within that data? Just do a descending sort on CBMs and it'll pop out at you. So some really basic things that you can do to save yourself from downstream trouble. But walking the warehouses will tell you if you have those problems. During COVID, some of the warehouse tours we did virtually, some as simple as someone walking with a laptop, the Zoom camera, just showing the warehouse. We even have a 3PL partner who has the small drones that they fly through the aisles and show us what's going on. Just some really neat stuff. And it's so simple, but it allows you to get a sense as to how your warehouses are performing. And use the data from your warehouse providers, whether it's Manhattan, Red Prairie, or whatever they use. Use the data from their system to figure out what goods are in that warehouse, and they've been sitting there for 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years, and they're not moving. And you'd be surprised at how much opportunity sits in just some of those cleanups. The nice thing about the toy industry is, even if you have to sell your excess inventory at half price, I mean, the gross margins in that industry are 40 to 60% typically. So if you're selling your inventory at half price, you're just recouping cost. If you're in the electronics industry and you have excess, if you have yesterday's microprocessor, you're in a lot of trouble. So, you know, a lot of times things that flow into retail are more forgiving, but you got to get on it. I was in a company a long time ago where we had a warehouse full of beautiful stainless steel Vermont castings barbecues. And they weren't moving out of the warehouse because the salespeople weren't getting commissioned on selling the prior year's model. And, you know, but this was walk the warehouse, you see the stuff there, and you know, you get on it. And if you have a good executive team that's highly collaborative, you know, you'll go deal with those issues. I see we got
interesting.
Andy Foa.
Yeah, this is I like this walk, you know, the Gemba
Hey, Paul.
concept. This is similar to the Japanese Gemba concept that we say, you know, that and this is something that we always push, that while you're sitting in your offices, there's always time to go down to the work area and take a walk, talk to people on that work area. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, I had NFI Logistics. Sid Brown is the owner of the company, and he gave me a list and he said, Paul, we have some goods that you have in the warehouse, and you have now spent more on warehousing these goods than what you actually sell them for. And so it was just, you know, he had a good sense of humor about it, but he said, I think you need to come down to the warehouse and have a look here. So it was,
Nice.
but out of those things, all of those things led us to make changes to our process and make improvements.
Yeah. Okay,
Andy, what's happening there?
Hey, Paul. How are you?
Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. Thank you for today's webinar. It was really insightful. You've been a great leader. You know, had the pleasure of kind of working with you back in Celestica days. But yeah, I guess I've got a question for you. I'm right now in AMD, kind of on the pricing side, but I've always been interested in the demand forecasting side. And in your space, can you talk a little bit about what you're planning to do? I guess now that AI is like that huge buzzword, and how can AI help with, you know, your demand? Like you said, you kind of have two cycles.
Yeah.
And how do you see AI helping you, and what do you want from AI engines to help you make better business decisions?
Yeah, I think if you look at the seasonal products that have two store sets, a spring and a fall store set, so that includes clothing, includes the toy industry and a lot of other businesses. There's two areas where you can take historic data and use it to help plan the future. And one is where you have like items. So you have a SKU that you know it should perform similar to the one you had before. So you use the data from that one before. And AI is potentially a way of pulling global data together if you've been selling those SKUs around the world, and dealing with some of the noise, and because you have structured and unstructured data sitting in there. I would tell you that when you retail into Europe, all the countries there, you really understand Walmart, Target, and Amazon, and Macy's and some of the others, how much good data they give you from point of sale. And then when you go into the smaller toy specialists and retailers in Europe, they're smaller, they're not as sophisticated, they don't give you the same data experience. So you have to deal with what they can give you, but it becomes almost unstructured data within your data set. So it helps you deal a bit with that. The second one is, if you're in a business that keys off of things like entertainment and movies. So we just came out at the end of September with the second full-length Paw Patrol movie. And so some of the SKUs were tied to the movie. It's our second movie. 2 years ago, we had one. I think in 2 or 3 more years, we'll probably have another one. And the spike that you get in toy sales from the movie 2 years ago helps inform how to plan production for the movie for this year. And so I think that's where you're going to start seeing AI kick in as well. And, you know, I would tell you, as you go now to the employee base, the number of different ideas and ways of bolting data together in analytics is, I think, only going to grow.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul, for your insight.
All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you. I'm just pasting a resource that is available for forecasting since the question was on that. It's a very interesting resource, Andy. It's free. And I don't know, the answer was wonderful, but if you needed something, maybe this would help.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
All
I
right.
think
Okay.
the
Thank
other
you,
one is
everybody.
oh, go ahead there, Piyush.
No, go ahead. Finish. I just
I was gonna comment. If you look at where I talked about these ecosystems, and if you're doing, call it more traditional planning and S&OP or something, so on, platforms like O9, Demantra, the IBP portion of SAP, those are places that a lot of companies will look to get a solid and predictable planning experience. As you go into more complicated worlds, you're going to see things like Kinaxis that I mentioned for electronics manufacturers. There's a company out there called Samya AI. I think they may have renamed themselves, and they're trying to expand from the demand simulation space and demand management to getting more of an AI company label. It's really incumbent on you to understand which of them work for your industry. And sometimes collaborating with competitors is an okay thing. Different industries do more of it, or less, depending on how they feel about each other.
Thank you. I know there are lots of questions, but we are already above our time. So I will have to cut this session here. If you have more questions, please feel free. I think Paul is on LinkedIn and you can connect with him there, or send us your questions. We'll be happy to connect you with Paul if you have some specific industry questions where you would want to use his expertise. Thank you, Paul, for this wonderful session. This is, it was great to learn from your experience that it's not just about my company running its supply chain, it's about my industry. And especially this thing about technology that you bring in, that it's a different world. I remember 25 years ago, we would not be having such a detailed conversation on technology because a lot of it was on Excel sheets and that's where it ended. So thank you for